I wasn't planning to make a video this week. Instead, my plan was to give an extra week to my Final Fantasy VII critique before Remake arrives. But I'm kind of tired of the misinformation being spread by large channels on this topic. So don't expect a ton of complex editing here. This video is mostly probably going to be random game footage the whole time, so that I can get this out quickly and move on. The title of this video might be seen by some as clickbait, and I suppose it kind of is. To be abundantly clear though, the title is mostly designed as a parody of the endless amount of videos whose titles say the opposite, claiming that the Series X is more powerful than the PS5, but then they proceed to get information wrong, or misinterpret facts because they rush their content, or weren't properly paying attention, etc. I think it's irresponsible to perpetuate inaccuracies for views, particularly when people see you as a font of accurate information. I'm amazed, disappointed, and disgusted at how some of this information has been twisted, particularly by a handful of otherwise solid tech channels. Channels that aren't focused on technical specifications get some leeway, but they still shouldn't muddy the waters if they aren't completely sure their information is accurate. People still take them seriously as trusted sources of information. However, tech channels should always get this stuff correct, the rare occasional mistake aside, or they shouldn't publish their videos at all. So with that in mind, while it's not technically accurate to say that the Xbox Series X isn't more powerful than the PlayStation 5, it is safe to say that it's not definitively more powerful. In the same way, it would also be inaccurate to argue that the PS5 is more powerful than the Series X. Numbers without context don't really tell the whole story, so if anyone you follow is throwing around things like teraflops or SSD speeds as the end-all be-all of the discussion, it's probably best not to take them seriously as a trusted source of information. This conversation, and where these consoles will ultimately end up, revolves around what I see as two different philosophies of design. As far as we know right now, Microsoft is choosing to brute force the problem of a new generation with the Series X. Or, as they're technically calling the console we know of right now, the Xbox. The version of the console they've detailed so far is by and large a straightforward modernization of what we've already gotten with the last generation. Newer, faster, better, stronger. It's worth noting that this statement is not intended to be a criticism of Microsoft. I think the Series X so far is a beautiful machine, and it's clear that they've put an enormous amount of thought and engineering work into it. Everything from the shape of the system to the way things like the shielding inside is slotted together are all designed to optimally accommodate for the hardware they're using. It's a precisely engineered machine, but in terms of the core performance updates, the Series X is exactly what everybody expected it to be and almost nothing more. Don't rock the boat and all that jazz. Sony, by contrast, is once again trying to emphasize innovation in the console space. This bit them pretty hard back during the PS3 era, their hubris after the PS2 giving them the impression that developers would just figure out their difficult-to-manage hardware configuration because it was the PS3. This time, however, Sony seems hell-bent on not making that mistake again, with Mark Cerny stressing that all of the innovations here are designed to at very least not make development on PS5 any more difficult than it was with the PS4 or Xbox One. And in fact, according to him, they've tried to emphasize making development for games while using their new console easier than it ever has been for a new console generation. And that's necessary because they're really pushing the system in some radical new directions. So let's take a quick look at all of the major specifications of both systems, detail the differences in as simple of terms as possible, and then weigh the potential strengths and weaknesses of these choices. The focus here is on dispelling incorrect or unproven assumptions you may have heard elsewhere, and hopefully doing it in a way that the vast majority of people can understand. To start, both the people who are arguing these consoles will hit 8K at 120 frames a second, and the people who think this is impossible are wrong. Neither company has actually marketed their consoles by saying that this was going to be the norm for games. All they've said is that it's possible to reach these numbers. Why is it possible? Not because the hardware is $5,000 hardware, it's because both consoles are using HDMI 2.1. That's it. That's why. This HDMI standard has enough bandwidth to enable such a feat, if the software and hardware behind it can actually pull it off. You can kind of think of this like the future-proofing of the original HDMI. It was included and could do 1080p even though most people were still using CRTs or at best 720p displays. It is interesting to note, however, that we could actually see some games hitting one or both of these numbers, but the caveat is that the games that do this are more than likely all going to be older titles or really light titles. It's conceivable to see some indie games occasionally doing 8K 120 frames a second if they're not demanding. Respawn Entertainment claims that they were getting Titanfall 2 to hit resolutions as high as 6K at 60 frames a second on the Xbox One X, meaning it could potentially also hover around higher numbers on the Series X or PS5. Okami HD actually internally runs at around 4K on the PS3, which is then downscaled to 1080p. Even on the PS4 Pro, Kingdom Hearts 1.5/2.5 locks to 60 FPS and native 4K at all times. It's unclear how much overhead they already have in KH 1.5/2.5 on the Pro, but again, with these new consoles both being multiple times more powerful than the Pro, it's not entirely unbelievable that a port of this compilation could maintain 120 frames a second at 4K, 60 frames a second at 8K, or even 120 frames a second at 8K if properly optimized for these new systems. With that said though, I wouldn't necessarily expect such a thing. Being possible is not the same thing as being likely. This will almost entirely depend on the demands each specific game has on the hardware. Next up is the GPU. As with most consoles, the Series X and the PS5 both use an APU, which is effectively a GPU and a CPU in one, which share the same pool of RAM. The GPUs in the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 are both based on the same AMD architecture as far as we know. There is some minor speculation that the PS5 is using a slightly older architecture with features from the newer architecture bolted on, but that's purely based on unclear wording and has not, to my knowledge, been substantiated. I personally don't think this is the case. So, the Series X GPU consists of 52 compute units, which are clocked at 1.825 GHz. Don't worry if you don't know what that means. Basically, you can think of compute units like workers, and the clock speed is how quickly each of those workers actually do their job. The PS5 GPU, by contrast, utilizes just 36 compute units, or 36 workers. They're also quite a bit faster than the Series X, though, being clocked at 2.23 GHz, which is significantly higher than the standard clocks of any non-specialty consumer-grade graphics card currently in the PC market. Mark Cerny argues they've found over time that it's generally easier to optimize around taking full advantage of fewer compute units, which means it should be easier to push the PS5's GPU to its limits when compared to the Series X. What's more, Cerny argues that clock speed is much better for processing large amounts of small polygons, which is interesting considering game models are increasingly using more and more smaller and smaller polygons. It's hard to say how accurate this is though, but his talk was intended for developers who would be using this hardware. This does technically lead to the PS5 GPU looking weaker on paper, since the almost completely useless teraflop figure you get from it is 10.28, where the Series X is sitting at 12 teraflops. But as technology has changed, this number has lost quite a bit of meaning, since so many more factors are involved than there used to be. The CPUs in the Series X and PS5 are both much more similar on the surface than the GPUs. They're both once again AMD chips that utilize the same architecture. They both offer the same amount of cores and the ability to do multi-threading. Both CPUs have 8 cores and can split these cores into 16 threads. This effectively allows room for twice as many operations at once if you don't need a whole core for something quick and simple. The Series X sits at a constant 3.8 GHz when only using 8 cores, and drops to 3.6 when using 16 threads. The PS5 is clocked at a maximum of 3.5 GHz, whether using multi-threading or not. This once again on paper looks like a clear win for the Series X, and in a sense it is when you look at the CPUs in a vacuum, though it's always worth keeping in mind that all of the parts of a console work in tandem with each other, and there's always going to be a bottleneck holding everything else back. What that bottleneck is will depend on the game being played, and the demands that game is putting on the hardware. So if a game never really pushes the CPU very hard, the Series X won't see a tangible advantage. And considering how underpowered the current console CPUs are, it could be years before we really see developers start to take full advantage of these new CPUs for anything more intricate than higher frame rates. The interesting difference with the PS5 surrounding the CPU and GPU is that neither of them run at a constant speed all the time like in a normal console. A lot of people have been reporting this incorrectly and treating this like an equivalent to boosting on the PC. PC hardware can temporarily boost up to significantly higher speeds than the speeds that they'll eventually settle at with stable thermals. For example, the CPU in my laptop has a base clock speed of 2.5 GHz, but can turbo boost up to 3.5 temporarily. You can almost think of this like nitrous in a car. You can temporarily use nitrous to push your engine far harder than it's designed to run, giving the car a lot more power. But if you push it for too long, you're gonna break something because your engine isn't likely built to withstand working that hard for that long. So at some point, you will have to dial it back. Similarly, when your PC hardware gets too hot from working so hard, it will throttle back down to acceptable speeds again. The system slows down so that it can cool down, which will lead to performance drops. This is also involuntary on PC, meaning developers don't have control over it and can't make your hardware boost consistently. The hardware itself runs as hard as it can when given the chance, and then dials back when temperatures rise too high, making it unpredictable on the developer end. This is not really how the PS5 works, despite all of the misreporting comparing these two ideas. In a normal console, the power delivery changes depending on the workload the hardware is under, but clock speeds are constant. With the PlayStation 5, it's reversed. The power delivery is constant, but the clock speeds vary. Power delivery is what produces heat. More power being consumed means more heat. Therefore, if power delivery is always changing, thermals can become unpredictable, and developer decisions can lead to the console getting hotter than the hardware designers expected. That means the cooling solution has to work harder, and your console becomes louder. PS4 Pro. With the PlayStation 5, power delivery is constant, so all Sony has to do is design their cooling system around the maximum power delivery threshold the system outputs, and the system is guaranteed to stay cool and quiet no matter the load. To reiterate, the console doesn't boost up and then throttle down when it gets too hot like a PC, which means as far as we know, you won't lose performance unexpectedly. Mark Cerny suggested that the console is designed around running at 100% load basically all the time if it has to. Developers should never randomly get slower clock speeds when repeating the same tasks, particularly since with their dev kits, it was confirmed that they can force exact repeatable clock speeds for testing purposes. It's exactly like the Series X in that way. The difference is that Microsoft is at the mercy of developers here when it comes to keeping the system cool and quiet, as with consoles in the past. Sony, meanwhile, just has to prepare for the guaranteed worst thermal scenario the console can have, and it will be good. That being said, I honestly expect both consoles will be pretty stealth in terms of noise levels anyway, since both have emphasized how much work they've put into that area of the design. Next up is the RAM configuration. It's worth explaining, since it's surprising how many people don't know how this works, that RAM is basically the storage space for all of the game assets your console is currently using in order to display the game on your screen. Assets are loaded off of your hard drive or SSD into RAM, and then your CPU and GPU can access them straight from RAM. If you're facing a set of buildings, those buildings and all of the assets related to them need to be loaded into RAM first. RAM, therefore, is designed to be incredibly fast, so that CPUs and GPUs can access these assets quickly enough to render out a solid real-time frame rate. Why do games need to spend time in loading screens? Well, because they're copying all of the assets off of the hard drive to store them in RAM. If a level in a game requires using all of the available RAM, then the hard drive first needs to fill that RAM with the required assets before you can play. A game that loads level by level like this often doesn't need to load in anything new at all until you reach the next level, at which point it will unload everything from the last level and only load in whatever is necessary for the new level. If that level is small, it'll naturally load quicker. Some games, however, like open worlds, have systems designed to swap assets in and out on the fly. But doing it this way means they're limited by the speed of your hard drive. After all, your CPU and GPU can't use an asset if it isn't in RAM, and it doesn't matter how fast your RAM is if your hard drive is slow to give the RAM the assets it needs. This is why open world games usually have huge upfront load times, but don't need to stop to load much at all once you're in the game. But because of this, they also have a limit to things like the speed of the player or the amount of the world you can see at once. Otherwise, it might not be able to load assets into RAM fast enough. So effectively, your RAM is limited by your hard drive speeds, and your CPU and GPU are limited by your RAM speeds. All 16 gigabytes of the PlayStation 5's RAM operates at a speed of 448 gigabytes per second. While this means it can deliver information to the GPU and CPU lightning fast, you're still limited by the speed of your storage hardware, which we'll get to in a moment. The Series X is a bit more complicated. It has 16 gigabytes of RAM as well. However, 10 gigs of it run at 560 gigabytes per second, where the other 6 run at 336 gigabytes per second. On top of this, the system reserves 3 gigs of the slower memory for system operations in the background, meaning it can't be used for games. Microsoft's argument for this choice is kind of similar to Sony's with the available clock speeds we discussed earlier. Microsoft believes that developers don't always need the fastest RAM for every task, and therefore allows them to delegate which tasks require the faster memory and which don't. Sony hasn't mentioned how much of their RAM pool is dedicated to system operations. Unless they have an extra few gigs specifically for running the operating system, which they also haven't mentioned, at least some of it will probably need to be reserved. However, it might end up being much less than the Series X, due to what Sony seems to believe is their ace in the hole, their SSD. Remember how I mentioned earlier that RAM is usually limited by the speed of your storage device? With the PS4 and Xbox One, this was a big deal because the absolute maximum speed you could get out of a standard hard drive like they used was about 100 megabytes per second. This meant that if you needed to fill 5 gigabytes of RAM, you needed to wait through at least 50 seconds of loading. Once loaded, the CPU and GPU could use these assets as per usual, but any extra loading that was necessary in things like open world games was an enormous bottleneck. Both of these new systems have upgraded to a solid-state drive. Solid-state storage is significantly faster for a multitude of reasons, but the simplest are down to raw access speeds and the layout of the information. Since SSD storage usually uses multiple chips to store information, it can access that information from all of these chips at once. By contrast, a hard drive has to access information by moving a single arm over a spinning platter, meaning it can only technically access a single section of data at once. This also means that some sections of data can be accessed faster than other sections, because the outside of the disk physically spins faster than the inside, so the average speeds of a hard drive are technically a lot lower than 100 megabytes a second. Where the maximum speed of a standard hard drive in this generation, again, was effectively 100 megabytes a second, the maximum speed of the Series X's solid-state drive is 2.4 gigabytes a second, with the PS5 boasting an astonishing speed threshold of 5.5 gigabytes a second. They can be even faster when accessing compressed data as well. Almost double the amount of information can be loaded at once for both of them, though that data then has to be uncompressed by the rest of the system, adding an extra step that slows things down. Mark Cerny did talk a lot about the new compression method they're using and how that factors into their intentions with eliminating storage-related bottlenecks. But for simplicity's sake, let's just keep to these raw speeds of 2.4 gigabytes a second and 5.5 gigabytes a second. What this effectively translates to is the Series X's storage being roughly 24 times as fast as the maximum speeds we've seen from this current generation, and the PS5's is 55 times faster. And when compared to average speeds of a normal hard drive, we can roughly expect those multipliers to double, and again, with compression almost doubling the information that can be read at once, you can basically double that. As a short side note, the slow speed of hard drives has forced a lot of developers to install assets across hard drives multiple times, so that when a vital and often used asset is needed, it can be found a lot quicker since there are multiple places to find it. This is particularly pertinent in open world games, since remember, they usually access assets on the fly while you're playing. So we could see game install sizes actually get smaller for a few years in the coming future, since tactically repeating assets is no longer necessary. The most basic benefit of the switch to SSD storage is relatively easy to figure out. Load times. When you can transfer 2.4 gigs of information a second, you can fill the Xbox's usable RAM completely in about 5.5 seconds. And with the PS5, even if all of the RAM could be used for games, you could theoretically fill it with raw, uncompressed data in under 3 seconds, thanks to the 5.5 gigabytes a second speeds. With their compression, it could be brought down to less than 2 seconds. That also means that with open world games, you can swap assets in and out insanely fast, which if the rest of the hardware can keep up, could virtually eliminate stutters and pop-in regardless of how fast the player is traveling. In this sense, it's kind of interesting because that means amount of RAM is kind of the bottleneck here. This is what Sony was showcasing last year when they explored the speeds you could travel in Spider-Man while running it on the PS5. But what's more interesting about the PlayStation 5 is that they've purpose-built this setup to allow the SSD to be used as sort of a backup pool of RAM. If they want, the SSD is fast enough that developers can have the CPU and GPU actually reference some of the required assets straight off of the SSD directly, instead of referencing them only after they've been put into RAM. As Mark Cerny illustrated, this can massively change the way worlds are designed, because a lot of the design language we've built up over time has been about allowing enough time for assets to be pulled from storage. You put a corner here or a wall there to make sure that the game has enough time to load everything behind it before you get there. But that's not necessarily the case with the PS5. There's a lot more to it, but in short, even beyond its raw speed, the relationship between the SSD and the system is specifically designed to be used live like this. To be clear, the Series X can do this too, but to our knowledge it hasn't been purpose-built to take advantage of this idea like the PS5 has, and since the drive is less than half as fast as the one in the PS5, it seems comparatively really limited. It's also worth noting that this isn't a new concept either. However, due to the speeds of these SSDs, it's now a technique that could be feasible to use much more frequently and creatively. On top of this, you can use the PS5's SSD to store something like an entire game state near instantly. You need less than 3 seconds to take an entire snapshot of your game from RAM and throw it on the SSD. Both Microsoft and Sony are talking about things like being able to store multiple game states and come back to them near instantly, but with the PS5, things could be quicker and potentially more flexible. A lot of potential applications open up for this sort of feature. It's also worth mentioning that people seem to be needlessly freaking out about the fact that Cerny mentioned that you'd need extremely fast SSDs that meet speed requirements to upgrade your PS5 storage, whereas the Series X is using what effectively amounts to proprietary memory cards for expandable storage. A lot of people are under the impression that it'll be incredibly difficult to find drives for the PS5 without doing a ton of extra research, but in reality that's not likely to be the case. Think about it. Go into any store that sells new games and accessories, and you'll find a large section dedicated to gaming hard drives for your current consoles. Companies love packaging things as gaming devices. What makes people think they'll suddenly stop doing that? I can all but guarantee that we'll see companies doing the same thing here. You'll walk into a GameStop or a Best Buy, look for the blue box that says PS5 SSD expansion on it, and you'll be safe knowing that's one of the drives Sony has approved. I see no reason why people will need to search Newegg and cross-reference detailed breakdowns of drive speeds or whatever to hunt down the right SSDs. Moving on, backwards compatibility with the PS5 has been misrepresented by a lot of people to be a lot more sparse than it actually is. This is partially due to the fact that Mark Cerny wasn't quite as clear as he should have been, but these outlets chose to state their assumptions about his words as facts. Sony then had to clear things up in a statement shortly afterward, because everyone else had jumped the gun. Gotta get those hot article titles, right? Microsoft's backwards compatibility on the Xbox One has been fantastic. It started rough, but they've been champions at taking feedback from those that know how these games should be running. It's something I thought was impossible without the use of FPGA hardware solutions, because I didn't think anyone would put in the effort. But Microsoft has, and their backwards compatibility with the 360 and the original Xbox is great. That seems to be the case with the Series X as well, since the hardware is designed intentionally to be as compatible with Xbox One games as possible. Mark Cerny likewise mentioned that they'd started working on PS4 backwards compatibility by testing the 100 most played PS4 titles on the PS5. He then discussed a few other things before finally making a statement about how they expected to have nearly all of them playing like they're supposed to be at launch. Naturally, everyone reported this as the PS5 only offering most of the 100 most popular games as backwards compatible titles at launch. However, this is not the case. We can actually expect basically every PS4 game to work just fine on the PS5 at or near launch. However, it'll take work to allow these games to utilize the extra power of the PS5 to deliver improved experiences over the original hardware. They're doing exactly what Microsoft has been doing and going through each title one by one, trying to make sure they work in boost mode. It's worth noting, we have no confirmation that every Xbox title will take full advantage of the Series X in boost mode either. As far as PS3, PS2, and PS1 backwards compatibility are concerned, that's more difficult. Sony has some relatively recent patents that could be related to emulating the hardware of these consoles, or that could just be for PS4 games on PS5 because the patents kind of match what Mark Cerny was talking about. Or it could be for something else entirely. I'd be incredibly impressed and incredibly happy if they figured it all out like Microsoft has, but particularly with the PS3, I don't necessarily expect it. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality of Sony's choices with the PS2 and PS3 in particular. They made strange hardware decisions back then, and now it's difficult to mimic that hardware through emulation. So to summarize everything real quick, with the GPU, Sony has chosen to go really fast but somewhat small, and Microsoft has decided to go slower but bigger. Teraflops aren't a good indicator of how things will play out, so don't use them as the be-all end-all metric. With the CPUs, Microsoft has a small advantage, but based off of responsible sources that are trustworthy like NX Gamer, the CPU difference might not make a huge impact for various technical reasons I won't get into here. Still, it's pretty safe to say Sony's just a bit behind in the CPU in that sense. Both consoles, meanwhile, should keep quiet, and to me, Sony's choice to allow the system to downclock while delivering constant power seems to at least partially be an attempt at cost saving in regards to engineering a cooling solution. With RAM, both are taking slightly different approaches. Microsoft's could cause some late generation issues, similar to how their use of slower DDR3 RAM in the standard Xbox with a small cache of ESRAM ended up being an issue when compared to the PS4's much faster GDDR5 RAM. But Microsoft's approach is also a bit more nuanced, which could benefit them. With storage, Sony seems to have a pretty massive and definitive lead, and their choices could have a massive impact on how games are designed in the future. This would also likely be where my presumed extra cost savings from the cooling solution are going. Meanwhile, while Sony's backwards compatibility seems like it could be really solid, Microsoft's is still far and away the service to beat. I would adore being able to put in my old copies of We Love Katamari or Need for Speed Underground 2 and play them at native 4K with completely solid frame rates. But more likely, at least at launch, we'll instead be able to play all of our PS4 games just fine, while maybe being able to play games like Kingdom Hearts 3, Sekiro, or Dark Souls 3 at a solid 60 FPS and higher resolutions for once. And similar to Microsoft, Sony could implement a convincing sort of post-processing HDR or even extra features like ray tracing in PS4 titles if they so choose. So then, which console is in better shape overall? Well, that depends. It obviously comes partially down to what you value more on a personal level, but it also comes down to consumer response, price, and developer effort. Generally, the lowest common denominator in terms of console power in a generation is always taken into account. As long as it doesn't bomb in terms of sales like the Dreamcast, or isn't light years behind like the Wii, Generally, all games will be designed to work on the weakest console. This is why, for the most part, the Xbox One still has playable games, despite every console stomping all over it in terms of power. So even if the Series X or PS5 trampled all over their competitor, said competitor would still to some degree be a target platform the game would be designed around. It may not get the best versions of each game, but the industry as a whole would to some degree be held back by it, and the games would more than likely be similar enough that it doesn't really matter to most people. But the opposite is also true. If a console offers something truly revolutionary that developers take advantage of, and that console does well, other console manufacturers can end up panicking in a rush to keep up. Or at least you can see consistently better features and options on said more revolutionary hardware. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Which console will come out on top in terms of technical game performance, features, and graphical quality will primarily come down to whether Sony's risks pay off. If we see them stomp Microsoft in terms of sales again, it's entirely possible that we'll see the PS5 be the core target platform, like the PS4 is. And if that's the case, Series X versions of multi-platform games could be missing a lot of polish in these areas. The console might not be taken full advantage of, but if Microsoft flips the tables on Sony, we could easily see many developers simply not choosing to waste budget and time on the PS5's more forward-thinking features, leaving PS5 multi-platform games at a disadvantage. I don't think either system would be at a massive disadvantage regardless, but Sony's extra work could go to waste. Meanwhile, many factors could alter the sales outcome of this generation. Price is one, though I don't expect either system to be over $500, and I actually expect them to sit at around $400 to $450 personally. Other factors include the question of whether the hardware works as advertised, or has high failure rates, how functional the OS is, and what new features it offers, if there are awful monetization practices and attempts to control players put in place, like DRM, whether players are willing to switch to a new platform ecosystem, console release date, availability, launch window titles, and a ton of other things. At this point, there's absolutely no telling who will lead at launch, or at the end of the generation, because neither system is really that underpowered compared to the other. I'd say Sony has a slight advantage only because right now more people are in their ecosystem, but that's it. About the only thing I can say is possible is that if Sony pulls this off and developers fall in love with the intricacies of the PS5, Microsoft could be left behind. I'd say that's largely unlikely though, so a more apt question would be whether Sony's risky choices will inform the next console generation or not. The most likely scenario is probably that both systems will run games to an extremely similar degree of quality, with Sony exclusives pushing technical design boundaries and Microsoft exclusives pushing raw numbers like frame rates or resolution. Regardless, it looks like we're gonna get a good generation this time around. But what do you guys think? What console do you plan to get? Why is that your choice? And what's your favorite feature out of those that have been announced thus far? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.
Pretty cocky, ain't you?